Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of History of English Literature, New Classics to Date. This is lecture number 16, and in this lecture we will study a Romantic age famous novelist Jane Austen. Dear students, this is Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Cohort University of Science and Technology. First of all, we will look at the discussion agenda for today's lesson. In this lesson, I will start with the introduction of Jane Austen, and then we will look at the beginning of the novels in 18th century. After that, we will evaluate Jane Austen's contribution in English novels, and it will be followed by discussion on the novels of Jane Austen. In the end, I will conclude the whole discussion. This is the whole outline for this very lecture. Now let's begin with the introduction of Jane Austen. Dear students, Jane Austen was born on 16 December 1775 and she died on 18th July 1870. Approximately the same period that coincides with the other famous colossal personalities of literature of Romantic age. And we see that in the Romantic age, literature had become too much emotional, and it was expressing that high imaginative line that was not expressed in the last century's literature, that was 18th century literature. And this literature was, or the Romantic age literature was full of feelings, sentiments and passions. So we call it undisciplined literature because it was not following the rules and regulations as the literary persons of 18th century were doing. So the novelists of the period carried themselves away from the world around them. Either they were into the romantic past, or they were into the romantic future. Either they were living in the thoughts of the past, or either they were predicting about the future life and they were living in the imaginations. So the novelists and the writers of this very time period, they were having very limited or restricted control over their imaginations. And Jane Austen, she was very different from the other writers, poets and the literary people of that very time period, because Jane Austen brought a wisdom, intellect and that common sense which we also refer as a good judgment to the literature. And you will see balance, stability and equilibrium in the novels of Jane Austen, and therefore we call that Jane Austen brought good sense and balance to the English novel. Dear students, now let's move toward the beginning of 18th century. Let's have a quick recap of the novel in the beginning of 18th century. We see that in the beginning of 18th century, Richardson and Fielding novels had been a very true record of the real life, which means that their novels were realistic and they were also incorporating the factor or the working of heart and imagination. So that was the mixture of the realism and the heart and imagination. That was the situation in the very beginning of the 18th century, but we see that in the last years of 18th century, literature became a bit different from that literature that was being followed by the topmost personalities of the literature. And now we see that there was literature of crime, or we may call it the literature of sin, and with it there was the literature of insanity or madness, and the last type of literature, that was the literature of terror, fear, horror, or we can also name this literature as Gothic literature. We see that how clear transition happened in the literature in 18th century. In the beginning, there was the literature which is very much connected to the real life, and it was having other ingredients like the ingredient of passion and imagination. But in the end of 18th century, we see that literature was very much shifted towards the crime literature, or the literature of insanity and terror. But the special thing was that Jane Austen, she reformed, she transformed and renewed the literature, and she brought discipline and control in the field of novels of English literature, and that was very needed one. That reform was very needed one in that very time period, and she did it at the right time. Let's move toward the other aspects, and that is that if we look at her personal life, we see that she lived a very calm and quiet life, or in another way we can say that she lived a very settled life. Altogether, she published 6 novels, and all of these novels were published anonymously. And we see that presently, or in modern era, these very novels have positioned her or placed her among the very first rank novelists of English literature. So these very novels which she published anonymously, and in modern age we see her in the front rank of English novelists just because of these novels. We see that she did the same thing for the English novels, what the Lake poets did for the English poetry. As Lake poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge and their colleagues, they transformed the poetry and they refined the poetry. We see the same thing. She developed, she polished and refined these very novels and made the novels sophisticated genre, and turned writing novels as a sophisticated genre. And we see that she made this art a very simplified one. She made novel a true reflection of English life. And we see that she mirrored that society which was there, and it was, as we often define literature as the mirror of the society, we see that in the novels of Jane Austen, that was the true reflection of English life. As I told you earlier, that Lake poets, and especially Wordsworth, intentionally or deliberately made poetry natural and truthful. Same thing was done by Jane Austen to the novels, and she refined and simplified novels. This is the contribution of the Jane Austen. Jane Austen, from that very time when she started writing his first novel, and that novel was Pride and Prejudice, she had that very thing in her mind, that she will depict or she will present English society exactly as it is or as it was. She was very much opposite to romantic excessiveness, the romanticism's excessiveness, as we see in the novels of Mrs. Anne Radcliffe and her school, as they were doing that extravagance in their novels. We see very opposite tradition in the novels of Jane Austen, and she was depicting the real society instead of that fancy and the society that was not present there. Let's see some other important aspects of Jane Austen's life. We see that she was very quietly working during the time that was the time of chaos, disorder, and confusion. We see that revolutions were happening there. French Revolution, American Revolution, and in literature we see that Romanticism was taking place of that literature of classicism, though it was pseudo-classicism, but the literature was transforming as the society of the Europe was changing, as the world was in the phase of confusion and turmoil. All these things were happening at that time, but Jane Austen was working very quietly. And we see that she made no great effort to get publishers. And one another thing, that she was very much satisfied with that small payment she got for these very novels. So all these things, very quiet life, and there was no dissatisfaction or discomfort or confusion happening in the life of Jane Austen. Very smooth, and she was at ease and satisfied with all these things. As I already told you, that she published all these novels anonymously, and she never permitted her name to appear on the first page of the novels. So she is one of the sincerest and the honest example in English literature, and she was an honest example of art for the sake of art, because she was just focusing on the literature, and she was having no such type of ambitions in her life to get name, because she never tried to put her name on the title page, and that shows that she was very much sincere to the art, and she was doing all these things for the sake of art. So now let's look at the novels she wrote. The first one is Pride and Prejudice, very important one, and the second is Sense and Sensibility. After that we have Emma, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and the last one is Persuasion. All of these are very important novels. Pride and Prejudice is an excellent and most widely read of her novels. That is followed by Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Mansfield Park. These three novels are now placed among the important novels or the front rank novels of the English literature. Northanger Abbey, now it gets the first place. We see that this very novel gets the first place on account of purely literary viewpoint, because there was no other passion in writing this very piece. And you see that it includes mild, subtle humor, and it presents that witty and the funny side of the English life. And we have a delicate, very slight satire in this very novel. These novels, and especially the last one, it does not include grotesque or the ugly image of the life. You do not see that bizarre or the strange feelings of the Gothic novels in this very novel, Northanger Abbey. Again, coming to the personal life of the Jane Austens, that she belongs to a very humble family, and we see that her father was a very modest clergyman, and she lived in a little village. Her life was very conventional one, static one. We do not see swift changes in her life, and she lived a very fixed life, conventional life. And though she made some short visits to the neighboring places, but her life was very much restricted to her village. But these restrictions didn't stop her to attain or to gain that amazing and superb artistic excellence or accomplishment in that narrow field of literature. And that all was because of her that sharp and delicate power of observation, or the command of observation that she had. And we see that she had an excellent objectivity or impartiality. She was having no prejudice in her novels, and she is having that self-detachment that we can refer that she was in the state of being objective to the surroundings, and she was very quietly and delicately, but we see that sometimes we have that satirical or ironical humor or wit in his novels, but that was not that strong, which we see that her novels were completely satirical or ironical. She was very delicate, especially in his satires or ironies. So we see that her circumstances, the place or status or the conditions in which she was living, that helped her to give that finish and delicacy to her work, which have made them artistically that much complete and perfect that now people are very much influenced by her. We see that she included that simple rustic life and the people from those villages as the characters of her novel. We see that she discussed in her novels the family and the family circles or the domestic life of these rustic people. She also narrated that how they gathered and how they celebrated different events in their life, and how especially the marriages influence the life of the common people. So it is that small, quiet world of these people that was free from those very high interests. We do not see tricky passions there, and it was not having those grand desires and aspirations or ambitions. There is no terrible, awful, or tragic struggle of life in the novels of Jane Austen. And the life which Jane Austen is depicting is very different. That life is free from all these very things. No mighty interests, no passions, ambitions, or the struggle of life. All these things are very far from the discussions which she was doing. She was following or she was discussing simple households, their celebrations, their happiness, their sorrows, and especially the aspect of the marriage is being discussed in the novels of Jane Austen. Now we will look at that she was not passionate to gain a big name, and novel writing was part of her day-to-day life. And whenever someone visits their home, she put aside and placed aside writing novels, and he or she or those visitors, they left their home, she restarted writing or continued the writing her novels. So she was writing novels not to be persuaded or followed by someone, or she was not trying to impress people. That is the most important aspect of these very novels. It was calmness for her when she was writing novels. It was tranquility in the midst of the family circles. So she knew very exactly that what she wanted to do, and she did it in the way that was appropriate for her. We see that she didn't get that appreciation in her life that she deserved. There was no such type of admiration for that she was worthy of. But later on, she was very much appreciated and rewarded, because we see that now in the present era she is placed among one of the greatest English novelists. And this very modest, humble and down to earth lady, she died in her 40s. After giving us such a wonderful collection of novels, she died in her 40s. Among her contemporaries, only Sir Walter Scott, he realized the greatness and that everlasting importance and worth of her works, and he very aptly remarked that the young lady has a talent for describing the involvements and feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. So that is the whole discussion, that how this very lady, she depicted the real life of the English society, though most of the people, they were following other traditions, and she is the one who refined, and she is the one who reformed and disciplined on this very genre of English novel. So I will say that Jane Austen is that star personality who simplified novels and made it a true reflection of English life, as Wordsworth did to the poetry, and turned the poetry as natural and truthful reflection of the life. And we see that Jane Austen was very opposite to the other romantic novelists who were following that the excessiveness, as Mrs. Anne Radcliffe and her colleagues were doing. So that is the end of today's discussion, and thank you very much for listening. See you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.